In an earlier episode of the DC show, we discussed the history of populism in the US and mentioned how mainstream political discourse often neglects to draw from this history. If the elites of today are afraid of a phenomenon that reached its previous peak roughly 100 years ago, we should look deeper into some of the theories surrounding populist ideology. Perhaps the best way to do this is to accurately define what populism is against. The best term I can think of today that represents what populism claims as its enemy is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism appears to us in many forms because of media framing. For the left, it is late-stage capitalism. For the right, it is usually globalism. In economic terms, which populists consider most important, the neoliberal era began with the end of the Keynesian regime that was characterized by the explanation of social services in the booming post-war economy. After the economy came to a halt in the 1970s, President Nixon ordered the disbanding of Bretton Woods, the institution that kept money tied to gold, and the US adopted fiat or free-floating currency. With the increasing development of computer technology, a whole new financial sector was born, and the economy was forever changed. This was further confirmed by the extreme anti-inflationist pro-interest rate policy of Jimmy Carter-appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, and the trickle-down economics of Ronald Reagan. When Bill Clinton adopted more or less of the same policies, the economic agenda proved to be thoroughly entrenched in the minds and actions of both US political parties. In addition to policy, the neoliberal international regime was guided by the philosophy of economist Milton Friedman and ideologues like Ayn Rand, whose radical individualism was promoted as the only viable option in a world where everything posed itself as a potentially totalitarian threat. Elsewhere in the world, the neoliberal era was characterized by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rapid privatization occurring in China by Deng Xiaoping. More blatantly authoritarian examples of privatization occurred in smaller countries like South Korea and Argentina, and monopolism brought countries such as Japan back to the world stage. When all of this was happening, true populism was largely absent from mainstream US politics. Its previous fervor was transposed to the arena of the culture war during the onset of mass media. The previous video mentioned how Nixon's populism was birthed in segregationist and Red Scare ideology. Nixon's own rhetoric was thus focused on a moral majority that emphasized a distrust of the press and the liberal elite, which only deepened with the advent of grassroots evangelism in politics. It's fitting that Watergate then set the precedent for coverage of all political scandals, and Trump's ideology of drain the swamp / fight the deep state bears a clear resemblance to many of Nixon's talking points. Populism became further displaced, but academics used figures like Nixon to smear the concept entirely as dangerous. Trump's only connection to traditional populism was his appeal to downtrodden classes that recognized the harm of austerity, but the connection became distorted when it took on a more cultish and moralistic characteristic, like in QAnon. Even if it existed in a form that overemphasized culture over economics, the anti-elite energy was clear. That populist leaders have arisen around the world to challenge the style of politics that defends austerity is no question. But whether or not they have actually managed to break from the stronghold of neoliberalism is something up for debate in itself. What's obvious, however, is the way the vast majority of media pundits say they want to defend liberal democracy and its sacred norms and institutions when they really just want to defend neoliberalism. Elites benefit from politics as a moralistic culture war, where greater economic questions that would put their interests at risk are not allowed to be considered in a fair light because they threaten the norms that have allowed for their consolidation of power. We now come to the question of Trump's populism. Despite his campaign promises and liberal media hysteria, the Trump administration was by and large no different from the consensus of previous Republican administrations going back to Nixon in terms of policy. It was only Trump's demeanor and attitude that presented itself as populist in the sense that it scared the aforementioned liberal elites. In terms of trade policy, however, Trump's isolationism garnered him lots of support from workers who were hurt by globalist free trade policies. But discourse around the upset of the 2016 election carried a lot of weight for the implications of populism when the media began to discuss the idea of economic anxiety, or that Trump was elected by a class of people who were not necessarily poor, but were afraid of falling into harder times. Scholars quickly counterbalanced this idea with cultural anxiety, or the conservative fear of America's changing cultural norms. Both hypotheses are thus intertwined with the recent resurgence of populism discourse and act as a testament to our increasingly anxious times. The events of January 6th will be cited as the prime example of what Trump's movement was able to achieve, at least in the sense that it vindicated the fears of the liberal media. That Trump inspired the gathering is no question, and that the Capitol security was unable to stop the entrance of the protesters certainly raises suspicions. But what's becoming evident is how the media and elected officials will use the event to condemn the dangers of populism, even though this movement was a largely unorganized force who accomplished little more than vandalizing the building. The rioters themselves show the confusing nature of how we define populism today. One could argue that they were acting more on behalf of QAnon and the energy suggested by Trumpism rather than Trump himself. A large coalition of variant ideologies, the main thing uniting them was they thought of themselves to be true patriots against corrupt elites. But rather than seeing the economic elite for what it is, they were persuaded by an ideology that depicts Trump as a savior against the demons of the deep state. If we want to rethink populism, we should investigate why such energy is being strictly condemned by those who refuse to ask how such levels of animosity have become a political force in the first place. Scholars have separated populism into its left and right wings based on examples around the world, and the socialists and nationalist leaders in question have always been characterized as authoritarian. But we must be skeptical of how much these populists can truly break from the status quo, just as we should be skeptical of the status quo itself. Likewise, many of the protest movements that claim to represent some sort of cause for the people found themselves working with both neoliberal political parties and NGOs. The existential question of populism remains on the table as the world economy continues to shift directions. With the increasing consolidation of big tech, or Silicon Valley companies, and the massive upward transfer of wealth in the wake of the coronavirus, many have questioned whether or not we are entering a new era of capitalism. Meetings of the World Economic Forum have discussed a great reset of the economy, which signals a shift from private ownership of goods to rent-style consumption and use on a large scale. It will be increasingly difficult for a populist movement to challenge this sort of high-tech neo-feudalism, especially as the questions of organization and speech continue to look bleak. Leaders constantly emphasize the importance of true democracy, but it seems like the more we strive towards it in our quest for representation in politics, the further away it becomes. It is an object of our desire that we cannot achieve, and thus the reason why populism went from being a movement associated with the masses to charismatic authoritarians. Defenders of traditional liberal democracy fail to account for the way norms and policies are dictated by elites without consent. In liberal politics, money still runs the game and decisions take place on an altar several degrees removed from people's everyday struggle. The true populist answer should be to simply be honest about this inherent contradiction, to expose liberal democracy's flaws and use the tools of government for something more impactful.